This video is brought to you by and sponsored by the organization of people who love painting hands, and low-key may have a hand fetish. There's something about how the way the light hits a bent knuckle or the way the shadow is cast over the fingers that are lying over your hand that just makes it so satisfying, so aesthetic. And so I want to show you how I break up the hand into simple shapes and forms, and then I'm able to then paint basically in most general gestures. And then when it comes to more complex hand poses, then I start using references, and I'll show you how I use those. And so let's talk about the basic hand shape, right? We break up the hand into 3 sections. We break it up into this middle section where it contains the anatomical terms, the metacarpals, and the carpals are right over here. So right here, you got your metacarpals, and your carpals right here, which are basically just your wrist bones. And then you got your thumb, which is, thank goodness, we have opposable thumbs, right? Or else we can't open that jar of pickles or whatever. Opposable thumb. And then the rest is all your beautiful, beautiful sausage fingers. And so if we're thinking about how we break up and draw any hand pose, we're going to start by laying down our general palm shape. Get in the thumb, just put a line in there so you get the general position and you're not too concerned about doing 3D yet. And then say we want to do that sort of Star Trek thing, the one where you put your 2 fingers like that. And so we're going to get the general form, right? 2 fingers, 2 fingers, 2 fingers, 2 fingers, and make sure there's that divot right here. Make it a different color so it's easy to distinguish right here. And then it's going to come down to your wrist. And so first off, how do we start fleshing out this form? Let me make this guideline a different color so I don't get confused as I'm drawing. But basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first lay down the thumb. And so if you notice on your hand, your thumb has this little muscle and bone that sticks out. So you're going to have to capture that right here. And it leads into your wrist. Leads into your wrist right here. Your palm will only stick out just a little bit. So let me zoom in. Right here. And right here is like your big old thumb muscle, right? Your thumb is made of 2 major knuckles. This knuckle here and this knuckle here. And oftentimes you're not going to see this knuckle here when your thumb is kind of stretched out like that. So you're really only going to see that first joint muscle. And right now I'm just teaching you how to draw a very generic, more slender looking hand. Right? And then the ends of the fingers typically end in more tapered sausage looking kind of shape. And so it's going to end up more like this rather than say like really flat like this. Especially for more feminine looking hands. We follow the lines that we lay down for the skeleton, fill it out, fill it out. And just keep in mind that there is distance between the fingers that naturally occurs. And so when we're doing this type of pose, we gotta make sure we stretch that distance and make it more obvious. Still following those lines, drawing somewhat sausage fingers in a sense. And we're gonna try to connect that over to our thumb, right? And the way we measure the height of the thumb or how long each finger should be, let's draw a default hand. The thumb will typically lie just a little bit higher than, say, where your fingers meet the palm. And so we gotta make sure that's not too long, or else you're gonna look really crazy, like you have some crazy thumbs up kind of thing going on. Your middle finger is obviously gonna be the tallest part of your hand, and it's gonna follow this general shape like this. Your pinky is obviously taller than your thumb, although it's gonna create this sort of diagonal. So if you can imagine it, it's gonna look sort of like a fin if you're gonna look at the general shape. And so when you're drawing it, you have to make sure that you're following that height difference, right? So between the fingers, there is a little bit of space. They're not just stuck together like scarecrow hands. And connecting here, we got our good old thumb. And when your palm is wide open like this, you're typically not going to see too much of a divot from your pinky to your palm all the way to your wrist. It's going to follow sort of a smooth curve. And that's like your general hand. And you're going to notice the measurements, right? This part is typically going to line up with your wrist. And so then your palm's going to stick out just a tad bit. And your thumb's probably going to be more outstretched because you're pushing it out. But obviously that just depends on how your hand is working at that moment. Usually right here, there is going to be a huge muscle, and you can even feel it when you're touching your hand. Try doing that right now. You can feel that muscle, and that muscle allows your thumb to do all the magical things it wants to do. Give thumbs up, squish an ant, give a thumbs down, have thumb wars, that kind of thing. And then residing next to it is a slightly smaller muscle and the end of like your wrist bones, and you can feel it right here, right over here. And this is the part where you typically want to be careful not to get carpal tunnel, because your hand is always resting on this when you're on the keyboard or the mouse. So hot tip when you're drawing, stretch out your wrist every 15-20 minutes and try to have a cushion that protects your wrist from getting stuck into like a kind of dipped position. And so let's try painting this, right? Shading this, giving it some form. And so first things first, when you're considering how to shade a hand, you're going to want to think of the hand as sort of like this kind of cube shape right here. And then everything else are these disjointed kind of, I'd say, semi-rounded rectangular prisms. Like they're not quite cylinders, in my opinion. I feel like there's a little bit more structure and more sort of edge to them, rather than, say, if you were to do your neck, that would be more of a cylinder. Right, just cleaning this up right here real quick. Anyway, erase these blue lines, and then we're going to start shading. We're going to treat this base color right here as our hand's base color, and we're going to lay down general shadows. And just know that you're going to have to capture that huge muscle in order for it to read properly. This part of the thumb, since it is sticking up high, is going to catch a lot of that light, whereas this part, it's kind of sitting more into shadow, hence why it's in kind of shadow. Right here, typically people have like that kind of tendon that's poking out from the shadow, just ever so slightly. And we're going to suppose that light source is coming from the right side rather than the left. And so we got to capture that, make sure we're shading half of our fingers. And if you feel your palms, you're going to feel that you have some of the bones poking out just a little bit right here in this upper part of the palm. And so they're going to cast just the tiniest bit of shadow. Just ever so slightly. We can darken up some of the shadows, especially when it reaches, like, say, these darker areas where light's not going to be able to hit it as much. Deepen up this shadow because this bone does protrude quite a bit. And that's like your very basic, very simple shading of a hand. I feel like shading a hand gets more interesting when you get your hand moving in more interesting positions, right? So let me pull up some sample images and we're going to practice drawing hands. Merge those all down and we're going to bust this out. And so with the link to the Quick Pose website, they also give you an option to cycle through a couple of images of hands. And so if you need more examples of or practice for drawing hands, feel free to go there and do that. And so let's start out with our big old thumbs up, right? We're looking at big shapes. So what is that shape of that hand? Well, it's this sort of curved out square where my thumb is sticking out this way and your wrist is sticking out there, right? I'm simplifying the fingers right here. So you have your very general stickman shape fist right here. We get to refine that shape because we have our guidelines. And so this is a male hand. And so we're going to see a lot more stubby fingers, more angular fingers. And so the ends of those fingers are to end in sort of like a broad chin, like I talked about in features. It's going to end in these square shapes rather than in pointed feminine shapes. Remember right here, you have our huge old bone that reaches into your wrist. And we're looking at the angle of the first knuckle to the thumb. And it's pretty steep. And so I'm going to break up the finger into these smaller rounded rectangles to help me place all the fingers in that spot. Right? I'm looking at how the shadows are working. All right, what I'm looking at is the angle of the overall hand. Am I capturing it? Let's see. I definitely think the wrist on the top part is getting there. This is right, but that palm to finger proportion is slightly off. And so I'm gonna move everything downwards. All right, so that's the general shape of it, right? We're gonna clean this up. And this is where we really start looking at our picture and seeing how the angles are working. And so since this part is where usually you would see like the first knuckle, there's going to be a slight divot as you transition from the palm to that first knuckle. And then we already have our guidelines for that first finger, so we just need to draw it in. Keep in mind we're doing rounded rectangular prisms. The way you measure whether or not you're getting the right position of the finger is always to find like a reference point. So I'm referencing, where does this finger end? Well, it ends at the first finger's knuckle, right? So there we go. Where does this fourth finger start? The ring finger. Well, it starts right at that middle finger's knuckle. So we're gonna make sure we do that, and it's gonna end about 3/4 of the way. And then finally, again, same idea. Where are we referencing? We're referencing from the other finger. And why I might be doing the thumb? Because I realize that distance between this and this part needs to be bigger. And so again, we're gonna put in our guidelines so we get the general direction and the feel. All right, and then we got her hand, right? And so this is like the first sketch of a hand. We can do some quick hash mark shading in order to capture that light and darkness, since it's so beautiful. So this part is fully in shadow. There's a cast shadow coming from that middle finger, casting onto the fourth finger. Again, another cast shadow on that finger. Right over here, we're going to notice that there's a distinct shadow region that comes from the muscle of the hand. A very distinct muscle region right here too. And we're not doing such a tight shading to indicate like this is lighter in value, obviously. And remember, if you're struggling, squint your eyes and look at the values. See where the darker areas are, identify it, and then go for it. Don't worry too much. All right, that's the first hand done. Now onto the second hand, which is this fist right here, which is a little more feminine. So let's move it over. Again, what's the general shape of that hand? This kind of weird oval shape. We're gonna break up this part into your 3 fingers. Make sure to capture that U shape. That last finger right here, and then your thumb's gonna be sticking out right here, right? And then you're gonna see that huge old thumb muscle popping out, and her wrist is at an angle. And then we start filling out the forms. We're gonna draw in our little sausages, right? Making sure that we're capturing, following the parameters we put in before. And there we go, we just drew a fist. Real easy daisy. We can add in the little nails, simplified of course, and you usually simplify just sticking out the nail a little bit and adding a little bit of that nail bed coming into the finger. Just like that. And it creates the illusion of a nail. And we can also do some quick hash shading here to capture that shadow. Especially on that huge old muscle in the front. And that's the second hand. Look how fast we did that one. I'm gonna shrink these one down so we have more space to do some more beautiful hands. And maybe this time we'll actually shade them so you can get a sense of how hands are actually lit up in form. And that will be helpful for when you're painting hands later on. Because hands are such complex color schemes because there's so much blood, so much vessels that you can see. And so that causes a lot of subtle changes in the skin. So the next one we're going to do is this one that's a little more natural looking, right? This one on the left. We're going to put in the arms, put in some blobs as a substitute for the hand for now. There's a good old phone. And then finally, another blob for that right here so we can get the general shape of the hand and position before we go too far in, and then it turns out we messed everything up, so we have to restart it, and that's always super annoying, right? So, as you can see right here, I put in sort of like the skeletal structure of the thumb right here to indicate, okay, that's where I'm going to draw the thumb. I'm going to skip straight ahead to drawing little sausages because the shape is generally relatively easy to recognize. Sausage. And I just put rounded sausages here for now as like a place marker, but obviously because this is a more masculine, more angular looking hand, we're going to have to sharpen up some of those knuckles later on. Throw in that wrist. And his hands are large, as you can see by how the width of the wrist in comparison to the width of his overall palm. So it gives off that vibe of like very safe, very strong. for the sake of our lesson, we're just going to keep this phone as a rectangle because I can't be bothered to also work on the phone while working on the hands. And so that phone's going to remain a lemon box. So just forget about it for a second, right? Okay, we're going to put in our skeletal structure for the thumb. So I have a good idea of how to place the thumb. And I'm using that edge of his hand as like a reference point for me to draw that thumb. And then that's how you know his wrist is actually a little more horizontal than slanted. And so we're going to extend that arm just like that. Using the reference point of this other hand, we realize his other side of his arm ends right where his first knuckle of that thumb pops out, right? All right, and now we're starting to fill in that shape. Again, his finger is going to end at more angular, more stocky end because it is a more masculine, very harsh angle kind of hand. For male hands, typically their hands end up being more rectangular looking rather than softer hill looking types of sausages, and their knuckles, their veins tend to pop out just a little bit more due to the structure of how their veins, I feel like, are more closer to the surface rather than deep set. And so you can imagine that the knuckles are placed right around here. His middle finger first knuckle is slightly higher up than his first one. And that's how we measured getting that other distorted sort of perspective of his finger working out. And then we had a placeholder here, but obviously we're gonna fix it up, make it more angular. And then last but not least, his pinky also's gotta get some of that angle in there. So we're gonna pop out those knuckles. All right, and then for the other hand, his thumb again is going to be more stubby, more angular. The nail beds usually are more stubby rather than very delicate looking. And remember, we gotta go back to our reference point, right? I'm using this hand as our reference point. And that's why I decided I'm gonna fix the position of the other hand because it's just not working out. It looks a little whack. And this is the power of our eyes, our observation. Look carefully at a sort of a fixed point that you think, okay, this is where I'm gonna revolve everything around it. And that's how you effectively use your reference point. All right, so this top of the thumb's where his wrist starts. And it's pushing up more at an angle. We're gonna zoom in a tad bit so we can get some of that beautiful stubbiness, that angularity of those knuckles down. And making sure that we have ourselves an accurate sloping of the wrists. All right, I'm gonna clean up these lines and then we're gonna try shading this. All right, and so we're gonna establish this beautiful silhouette of the contour, right? This whole side of that hand is in silhouette. And so we're gonna treat this as like the silhouette color. Half of that arm is gonna be in shadow. Right here, you see that super bright light. Gotta capture it. This right here is probably slightly lighter. With the shadow being cast by that fourth finger, right? Just right here. Continue on with our silhouette shape. Right here, you're gonna see that it's starting to get some light because light is sort of slipping through those fingers because his first finger is kind of pushed down a bit. And so you're gonna see it highlight his knuckle and then bounce away. And his first really prominent vein is casting this huge old shadow right here. It creates this weird shape that I'm not going to question, and I'm just going to follow along for the ride for now. We'll refine it in a bit. Right here, you got a big old shadow because it is so bony and raised up. You end up getting a shadow right there. Squint your eyes, try to see the general shapes. Try to erase away so you can see some of that knuckle again. This whole section is in shadow because it is basically blocking against that light, right? Just using a lasso to quickly get it in there so I don't have to spend so much time actually brushing it in. Use a big old brush. Don't waste your time with the small brushes, and it usually ends up with more neat looking brushwork anyway. Alright, and since we want to darken up that area, we're going to switch over to a soft brush to get that radial shading. To make our lives easier, we're just gonna shade in this phone dark gray so it gets out of our face and it helps define some of that really bright light that you can see on the hand. All right, so that's how you would break up the shape of the shadow, right? You can see I didn't do too many value changes. I did mostly big overarching shapes, capture the light, and then turn those simplified shapes. You read it as like a hand, right? We can do one this time by just painting it and not drawing it. How about we do this top one, right? Again, similar to how we do gesture practices, we're going for the general shape. Get me that hard brush again so I can clean up my lines better than I did before. And we're gonna put in our super, super bright lights. And there you got like this really generic looking hand. Obviously, if you want it to look even more crisp, you would spend some more time to develop some of that deeper shadow, but that's just the general idea. So let's move on to drawing feet, because feet can be complex, but they're also relatively simple. And so feet, what is the basic structure of a foot? A foot consists of your good old leg, the triangle, and then your toes area. Here is where your ankles would be, with your inner one being lower than your outer one. From the side view, again, a triangle shape. With your heel, slight arch, just ever so slightly, depending on whether you have flat feet, more arched, and then your toes, your ankles, and from the back, it's again rounded triangle where you get to see the tendon right here, your heel, your ankles, right, and partially your front of your foot, right? So when you're thinking of drawing a foot, you're going to want to always think about this triangle shape. This part of the front of your foot is basically this part, and it's going to curve, like swoop down, and that's why you create this sort of triangle shape when it's shading, when it comes to shading like this. And toes, don't worry too much about drawing every individual one. Honestly, most time when I'm drawing feet, I tend to simplify it. Say like if I'm drawing right here, break it up, treat it as though it's like a shoe kind of thing, right? Underneath of your foot is gonna be similar to how your shoe prints look like, right? With your toe being the biggest, and then it's gonna swerve down, that kind of idea. And to think about it in 3D, we're gonna again draw that triangle, pump it out. And then just imagine that you're rounding out that foot, that there's dimension to it. Right. And that would be like the general shape of the foot there. And then you would just add in your toes right here. Only really your big toe has a lot of mobility. The rest of your toes are kind of stuck together, just like that little rhyme, like 3 little piggies went to the market kind of thing. And so when you're drawing, say if like your foot is flexing like crazy, like you have a cramp in your foot or something, really mostly only your big toe is gonna respond to that cramp, and your rest of your toes are gonna fall in like a similar direction, all group up this way. And so I'm just gonna reiterate, when you're drawing a foot, always want to draw your triangle shape first, and then the rest is supplementary, right? Lower ankle is on the inside, outside is upper, higher. So let's do some examples of feet and practice drawing them from not so conventional angles, and so you get a chance to like get used to placing feet into shoes and that kind of thing. Because once you just have the general idea of how the orientation of the soles of your feet go, then when you're trying to put them into shoes or whatnot, they're gonna be way easier because you don't have to draw on the toes and everything. And so let's draw this guy walking away first, right? So again, we're capturing that general direction. Put in our feet, pretend they're shoes. Yeah, actually, sorry about that. Flip that. The inner corner is actually, inner side of the foot is actually higher than the outer. My bad. Honestly, easy mistake. Regardless, just look at your own foot, and whatever your own foot does, do that. Right? Inner, out. Back to our practice. Ignore my mishap. I'm drawing in the triangle, which will indicate this is where your heel's at, your ankles, and the rest of your foot's gonna be right here. So following that direction, I'm gonna put in my good old, put in your calves. I forgot what the scientific term for them are, but I'm not a med student, so whatever muscle groups I do pick up is usually from working out or getting them injured, and so that's why I would know them. So your ankle, your heel, front of your foot. This side again. We'll move that baby over. Because it is a lot closer to that calf, right? If you look at it, our reference point again, always looking at our reference point. So right here's where your heel would go, your calf, and it's like a chicken leg kind of distortion. It's gonna connect to here. This is where the ankle is. See, I don't even draw on the toes properly because it's so tiny. What are the chances you're really gonna see it, right? Unless you're doing like a full view of a foot, then you might want to be more concerned about it. So say like in this picture where your foot's like crazy in view focus. So we're gonna get the angle down, you see? And you're gonna notice that this foot's like way bigger because it is foreshortened. This foot is in the further background, hence why it's smaller and angled out that way. Now for the toes, what you're gonna do is separate the big toe and the rest of the toes. You're gonna draw a mark where the toes end at, so you have a general direction. And you're gonna draw your big toe, second toe, put in your last toe first, because I find that when I put in the pinky, I have a better like facial reference of how big the toe should be in order to fit every single one of them. And then if we were to shade this real quick, get our base shadows. And the undersides of the toe are obviously going to be darker, right? And again, same idea as painting fingers. They're more like rectangular, soft rectangular prisms rather than cylinders. And so there's going to be angles due to the bones in your feet and hands. And make sure you're pushing this part of the foot out, just because if you're being foreshortened, imagine the front part of your foot is like pushing towards us, and so it's going to overlap the back part of your foot. Every so often, I'm squinting my eyes to check on the values, making sure that I'm capturing the right shadows and not focusing too much on the subtle nuances, right? And there you have your foot, right? Real quick, real easy. And I'll just end this class by drawing a foot that we don't have an example of, but by using the same concept of doing triangles and that kind of thing. So we're gonna try drawing a foot, maybe say like a ballerina foot or something. And ballerina foots are going to be extra curved, and they're going to be straight down, right? Because they're standing on their tippy big toes, right? And that's your foot. Maybe her other foot's like right here. Drawing it like a shoe, breaking up the big toe, the rest of the toes. The other toes are gonna be more curled in just because that's how tiny they are, and like how your foot manages to fit all 4 other little toes on a small surface. Right, and if you were to do it from, say, they're sitting down on their knees, you get full blast of the soles of their feet and their toes. Right, it would be something like this. Obviously, you're not going to see all those tiny little toes because they're tiny and they're being covered up by your big old toe. And you would just shade this again. And if you're not sure about lighting source, I always highly recommend trying to create it yourself, because it's not going to always have it available on the internet. And it's so easy for you to just shine a light on yourself, sit down on the ground, take pictures of your foot, right? We're not putting them online, obviously. We're going to keep them to ourselves because I do not want some weirdos out there going crazy over my feet, right? Feet pics are only for me. And there you go, you see that? You notice that there's this muscle that popped out right here, and that's like, if you look at your own feet, that's the same muscle that your big toe is controlled by. And so when you sit down like that, you're gonna obviously see that muscle casts a shadow. And so hopefully those tips were helpful for you when you're considering how to render a hand or a foot. And we're gonna start talking about overall composition of illustrations in the next video, and I will see you then.